Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating topic: how governments try to fix themselves. It's something that's at the very heart of public administration. So glad you can make it to our study group for PP 5340, Introduction to Public Policy and Management. We're going to tackle the readings from Section 5, all about new public administration and administrative reforms. To do that, we'll be pulling from two key sources: a report by Jonathan Breul and John Kamensky for the IBM Center for the Business of Government, and a great research paper by Jose Alonso, Judith Clifton, and Danielle Díaz-Fuentes. Let's jump in. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll look at this whole idea of fixing government. Where did it come from? Then, we'll pit two presidents against each other to see their different approaches. After that, we'll break down two of the main tools they used: outsourcing and decentralization. And then, the big one. We'll look at the data to see if any of this actually shrank government. We'll wrap it all up with some real-world lessons for anyone thinking about reform.
Okay, Section 1. So, have you ever noticed how it seems like every politician, every new administration talks about fixing government? Well, it turns out that's because this is not a new idea. Not at all. It's a challenge that's been a part of American politics for a very, very long time.
I mean, just look at this quote from that Breul and Kamensky report. They point out that government reform has been a thing for over 100 years. It goes all the way back to Teddy Roosevelt. So this desire to make government work better, to make it more efficient, is a deep-seated part of our political DNA. And that really sets the stage for the modern stuff we're talking about today. So the big idea that really shaped these modern reforms is something called New Public Management, or NPM. The thinking was pretty simple, The government seems slow, kind of bloated, inefficient. So why not take all those smart, efficient, bottom-line ideas from the private sector and just apply them to government? Run it more like a business. That was the core concept. And probably the most famous example of NPM in the US was the Clinton administration's whole Reinventing government push. It was led by Vice President Al Gore, and it was called the National Performance Review. The goal was to make government work better and cost less, by focusing on results and, get this, treating citizens more like customers.
But here's the thing. NPM isn't some single one-size-fits-all plan. And to really see that, it's super helpful to compare the Clinton administration's approach with his successor, George W. Bush. That Breul and Kamensky report does a fantastic job laying this out, and you can see two totally different ways of thinking.
This is where it gets really interesting. On one hand, you have Clinton. His approach was huge. We're talking over 1,200 recommendations. It was a bottom-up effort getting frontline employees involved, and they celebrated wins with these hammer awards. Then, on the other hand, you have Bush. His agenda was laser-focused on just 5 big problems. It was totally top-down, driven by the pros at the Office of Management and Budget. And their motivational tool? Instead of awards, they used public scorecards to create, and this is a direct quote, shame and humiliation to get results. I mean, wow, you can't get much more different than that.
Okay, so we've seen why they wanted to reform government, and we've seen how different leaders approached it. But what tools did they actually use? What was in the NPM toolkit? Well, two of the most popular ones were outsourcing and decentralization. And for this, we're going to turn to the work of Alonso, Clifton, and Díaz-Fuentes to really understand them.
First up, outsourcing. The logic here is straight out of an economics textbook. The idea is that if you make government services compete with private companies for contracts, that competition is going to naturally drive down costs and make everything more efficient. It's all about bringing that private sector discipline into the public world.
And the second big tool is decentralization. This one is all about shifting power away from the big central federal government and pushing it down to state or even local levels. The theory is that the folks on the ground, at the local level, are closer to the problems. They can cut through the federal red tape and get things done faster and better, which should, in theory, lead to a leaner government overall.
So, this is it, the moment of truth, the billion-dollar question. After all the reforms, all the theories, all the effort, did any of it actually work? Specifically, did these popular NPM strategies actually succeed in shrinking the size of government? Lucky for us, we don't have to guess. That paper about Alonso, Clifton, and Díaz-Fuentes crunched the numbers for us. Let's tackle outsourcing first. All that talk about market competition and efficiency, did it actually lead to less government spending? What do you think?
And the answer from the data is nope. Not at all. In their analysis of 15 different EU countries, they found zero connection between outsourcing and a reduction in government spending. The theory sounded great on paper, but in the real world, it just didn't result in a smaller bill for the government. Kind of surprising, right? Okay, so outsourcing struck out. But what about that other big tool in the toolkit? What about decentralization? Did pushing power down to the local level actually have the effect everyone hoped for? And here is where the story gets a twist. The very same study found that yes, decentralization did actually correlate with a smaller public sector, at least when you measure it by government spending. So while the market-based approach didn't seem to cut costs, the powers to the locals approach actually did. All right, let's bring this all home. We've seen a long history, 2 different presidential strategies, and some pretty mixed results from the data. So what are the actual takeaways here? If you were put in charge tomorrow, what should you do? For that, let's go back to Breul and Kamensky for some real, practical advice. According to them, if you're going to try this, there are 3 things you have to get right from day one. First, you've got to move fast. Start within weeks and make sure the president has your back, loudly and publicly. Second, you have to know what you're trying to do. Is the goal just to save money, or is it to actually make services better? Pick one. And third, you have to decide how you're going to do it. Are you going top-down like Bush or bottom-up like Clinton? But a strong start isn't enough. You've got to follow through. And that means you need the right structure with a dedicated team and leaders who actually understand change. You need a real strategy, a roadmap that's tied directly to the budget so it has teeth. And then you have to be relentless about execution, using the president's influence and transparent tracking to keep everybody's eyes on the prize. Which kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about for class. The data seems to show that just cutting costs is, well, maybe not the right goal, or at least it's a really hard one to achieve. So if shrinking the government's budget isn't the end-all be-all, then what is? What should the real measure of success be? Better services for citizens? More trust in our institutions? That's a huge question, and it's one the next generation of public managers, people like us, are going to have to answer. Thanks so much for joining our little study session.